Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series on the International Churches of Christ. Usually, I would start these segments with a longer intro, but as CrimeCon UK in Glasgow last weekend was such an exciting experience, I have only just started getting my voice back. With Laura taking the helm of this conversation, I don't think I need to give any extra context. But I do want to apologise for our editing software releasing episodes in mono again. I know it must be so frustrating if you're waiting to hear an episode and you can't listen because it's only coming out of one speaker or one headphone. I am putting extra steps in place to ensure future audio comes from both speakers or earphones or earplugs or earbuds or however you listen to your podcasts. But if you do hear this error, please feel free to contact me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com and let me know so that I can make the necessary changes as soon as possible. And please accept my sincere apologies for these errors once again. Hello and welcome to newest patron Raina, who took great care of me and so many others at the weekend at CrimeCon. Thank you for being a supporter of the show and a friend. I truly appreciate your support, and I hope to see you at London's CrimeCon in September 2024, although I'm sure we'll be catching up on a daily basis. Please make sure you access your exclusive content, Raina, and thank you again for being here. In regards to CrimeCon, I'll be telling everyone all about it with a bonus episode that will be dropping shortly. But that's enough of my croaking. It is a pleasure to introduce Laura. So hello, Laura, and welcome to the show. Today we're going to be covering something that we have spoken about on the podcast a few times, but today we're coming at it from a slightly different angle. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. My name is Laura Davis. I was born and raised in the International Churches of Christ. I left when I was 16, and I have been out ever since. I live in New York City with my husband and 3 kids, and I am studying, I guess you could call it adolescent social psychology. I want to learn and study how social identity is developed in adolescence, throughout like growing to adulthood, in healthy ways, and what happens when you're in a harmful environment and the effects and the impacts of that. Just because of my own experience, and yeah, and so I'm also attempting to start a podcast very soon called Kingdom Kids. That was the name of the children's ministry in the International Churches of Christ, and people were often referred to as Kingdom Kids or asked, like, "Are you a Kingdom Kid?" And that meant, were you raised in the church? And if you were raised in the church, of course, you had, higher expectations placed on you and more pressure put on you, and you were, at a certain place in the rankings, so to speak. But yeah, I just have a real passion for people who have grown up in these kind of environments. Kingdom kids, fellow Kingdom Kids, former Kingdom Kids. I guess I don't know if I should call myself still a Kingdom Kid, or I'm a former Kingdom Kid, I guess. But yeah, I have a real passion for helping people. It's an incredibly confusing, disorienting, and unique experience. Yeah, so that's me.
Thank you, Laura. That was a wonderful introduction. And I'm just looking at this beautiful exposed brickwork behind you as well. Is this part of your home?
Thank you. No, it is a co-working space. I live in Harlem, and there's a co-working space that I just got a membership to, which is perfect for this kind of thing. So yeah, I wish it were my home, but no.
I would love something like that. It would remind me of like an old English country home with, the wooden beams and the exposed brickwork as a feature wall in your home, and then a beautifully ornate fireplace of some type in the library with a big shaggy dog.
Exactly. It's really nice. It's really nice. But
So we're going to be talking about the International Churches of Christ. ICOC, sometimes people refer to it, or ICC, I think I've seen it referred to at times.
It used to be referred to as ICC sometimes, back like decades ago. But ICOC became more of how it was, the acronym, I guess. And Kip McKean, who founded the ICOC, when he left, he started another movement, which was God's movement again, somehow. He started his own movement, and he started what he called the International Christian Church. So that is called the ICC. So it can be a little confusing if you're like looking at old forums and things like that. You'll see people refer to the International Churches of Christ sometimes with the ICC acronym, but mainly they go by ICOC, and there are already recovery groups online for the current group, the International Christian Church, ICC. So I hope that clarifies that, but
It does, and it sounds as if this do-over was no better than the original by the sounds of things, as if there are forums for survivors of this replicated group
yeah,
by the
yeah,
same man.
it's not only no better, but I mean, from what I've read, it sounds even worse, because it's like if you're a narcissistic, right, person, and I can't say that I don't know diagnostically, like, right, if the leader is, but, we do know that a lot of leaders of coercive groups are narcissistic. So, yeah, so I think if you are that kind of leader and you are narcissistic, if you don't start to get better, you get worse. You only get worse. I mean, that's kind of what I believe. So he, because it didn't work out with his first movement, and he ended up leaving or getting pushed out, or sort of a combination of those things. He started his own movement, another movement, and I think he just went, bigger and bolder and all that kind of stuff, because, that's just kind of how it goes. It just gets worse and worse.
So if this Kit McKeon started the ICOC, the International Churches of Christ, can you give us a brief overview of this original movement that brings us into where you place into this timeline?
Yeah, absolutely. I will do my best, because it is, sort of convoluted, and as a lot of these movements are, they're often, there's a web, around them of different movements and different things going on. But the International Churches of Christ actually started in the mainline Churches of Christ, which I know we had mentioned Ashlyn earlier, but Ashlyn Hilliard, who has People Leave Cults, she grew up in the Churches of Christ. And they are a fundamentalist, Christian church. It's a little interesting. I mean, I would definitely call them fringe. Most of the people that I meet who I've mentioned the Churches of Christ to, not the International Churches of Christ, but just the Churches of Christ. Most people I've met who are familiar with them, who are Christian themselves, have said, "Oh yeah, isn't that a cult?" about the Churches of Christ. And so I mentioned that too, because it's been hard for me to kind of dissect all of that and say, wait, where does that leave the Churches of Christ? Like, what kind of church are they? But anyway, they're fundamentalists. The Churches of Christ, they believed in like biblical lyricism, strict interpretation of the scriptures, very rigid. They don't have any music in their congregations. They're all a cappella, because they believe that, well, we didn't see that in the New Testament, so therefore we're not going to do anything that, again, just kind of very much like we're going back to the fundamentals here, and these are the fundamentals, and now we're going back and doing things right. And so and I actually had a conversation about a year ago with a friend, Ian, who grew up Church of Christ. And it goes back on both sides of his family, 5 generations. And he told me growing up that he was told, like, yeah, if you're not going to this church, you're going to hell. Like, and anyway, the Churches of Christ, and they're also interesting in that they're all autonomous. Like there's not like a govern, like if you look at the Southern Baptist Convention or Southern Baptist congregation, they have like, at least they have like a board or something, right? I mean, not that it didn't really do much, right? Because they had all this systemic abuse they were covering up, but they at least had a structure to the organization. The Southern Baptists did. The Churches of Christ don't have that at all. They are all autonomous congregations. But they all hold these very like traditionalist, like again, fundamentalist sort of beliefs and doctrines and things like that. But anyway, all to say, and my parents were born and raised in the Churches of Christ. So that is kind of how I ended up in the International Churches of Christ. So my parents were born and raised in the Churches of Christ. And I appreciate talking to my mom about it because she helped me understand sort of why she even joined the International Churches of Christ. But, my grandfather was a Church of Christ minister for his entire life. So my mom grew up a pastor's kid, the oldest as well of 5. And she remembers talking to her dad and saying, Dad, and just observing the congregations. But a lot of these Churches of Christ congregations, a lot of them are in the South, in the Midwest, and they would be very small congregations, almost all entirely white, but also like very like older people, just and very much like dying out. Like a lot of people weren't coming anymore to church, as I think, over the past century, more and more people don't come to church anymore. But people, weren't coming to the Churches of Christ. And my mom would talk to her father, my grandfather, and as a teenager and say, Dad, like when I see my Baptist friends, they want to go to church and they want to like they invite their friends to church, and they they like to talk about the Bible. Like she's like, I don't have any friends at our church that want to do that, or that they just show up and leave. There was no, I guess, energy from her teenage, and I mean, she was a teenager, I think, when she was talking to her father about this, or maybe in college. But that was very much her reality, was seeing that this church that she had grown up being told was God's church and the only church, right? The true church. And people just weren't coming anymore. There was no excitement around joining. People her age didn't really care, and she saw other denominational groups doing things in a more excited and I don't know, sincere way, I guess, right? Enthusiastic way. And so she was just like, what's that about, right? So she's in college with my dad, and my dad also was born and raised Church of Christ, and Kip McKean, who becomes the founder of the ICOC, he, I think, is baptized into the Church of Christ. He's converted to Christianity, to Churches of Christ version of Christianity, in the Church of Christ. And is also heavily influenced by someone named Chuck Lucas, who had a very big movement in Gainesville, I believe, at the Gainesville Church of Christ, that was also somewhat involved with Campus Crusade for Christ. So there was a big, I want to say like this, the 70s, of course, because it's always the 70s. Like I want to say mid to late 70s, there was a big movement within Campus Crusade for Christ and Chuck Lucas's I believe it was Gainesville, although don't quote me on that. Maybe we can Google it later. But in Florida, for sure somewhere in Florida, big movement on college campuses where they were heavily recruiting on college campuses, and people were coming to church and people were getting baptized and people were converting, right? And Kip McKean is a part of that. And he's, very charismatic and very, just swept up in this whole movement. And Chuck Lucas actually ended up, being forced to resign for what we now know as being a sexual predator. It was at the time rumored to be homosexuality, but actually he was forcing himself on other men. Yeah. And I just think I just have to say, like, I'm so fed up with like homosexuality, like being the thing that's wrong or being the thing it's so evil to even create that narrative that, oh, well, he was gay. No, actually he was sexually assaulting and harassing men. Like that's the problem. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's the evil. Anyway, anyway, he was forced to resign. And Kip McKean took over. Not in an official way, but he sort of he rode on the coattails of that movement. And I think it was called the Lexington Church of Christ. He ended up at the Lexington Church of Christ, which is a very small, again, a small congregation of the mainline Churches of Christ at the time in the late 70s. And my parents moved up to Massachusetts and were a part of his movement. And I mean, I can imagine for the Churches of Christ, like, he looked like, oh, this is going to save us, or people are going to start coming to church. I don't know. I don't know exactly what everybody was thinking, but I can imagine it resolved a lot of things for some people, or at least he met a need that was actually there, which is often the case, right, in coercive groups, is that there's somebody who comes in who is meeting needs, and doing good, quote unquote, good things. I mean, I'm going to say quote unquote good things, but good things are happening. Things are happening that are good and or that were needed, and it seems great, right? But it wasn't. And so anyway, the Lexington Church of Christ became the Boston Church of Christ, which was also known as the Boston Movement. And throughout this time too, I want to say, especially during the 90s, there were several people from the church, not several, but I want to say there were a few key people from the Churches of Christ. One in particular, I think, was a psychologist or maybe a sociologist, an academic, who wrote a book called The Discipling Dilemma about the International Churches of Christ. Because at the time, right, I think in the, throughout the 80s, it was just a part of the Churches of Christ. It had not separated and become its own church yet. So I think people who were observing this, that were currently not a part of that movement, but were in the Churches of Christ, were observing it and noticing that there were some unhealthy things going on. And so there were some people that were speaking out about it. Again, unfortunately, it was too little too late, and because the Churches of Christ are not they don't have that sort of structure, right, to come out and to come together and unify and say, oh, we're gonna, we're gonna speak out about this man and he's dangerous and all that kind of stuff. Like, it wasn't enough to prevent all the harm that happened. But yeah, that's sort of the backstory. And my parents, again, they joined in the late 70s, early 80s, and were a part of the movement for over 23 years. And I was born and raised in the Nashville Churches of Christ. And after my parents moved up to New York City, they left the Churches of Christ when I was 12 in 2003. There was a big letter that got circulated that a leader in the movement wrote about the abuse that was happening in the church. It was called the Henry Crete letter. It just went, spread like wildfire. And my parents were close friends with Henry Crete. They weren't leaders in the church, but they were, they'd been there for so long. They were a part of the original movement. So they were friends with Henry, and they decided to leave, and a lot of people left. A lot of people left. And the church has now created this narrative that they are, quote, not like that anymore. Because Kip doesn't lead the church anymore, right? And it's like, okay, but what about all those leaders that were led by him, and who lead exactly the same way that he does? What happened there? Where is the accountability? And all those people are still in leadership, and so it's just, so anyway, they left in 2003. But in a weird sort of turn of events, I was still going to the church youth group on Wednesdays, because my parents decided to homeschool us. They wanted us to make sure we had friends because we were socially isolated, and they were like, oh, and I think they were confused too, to be honest, like they didn't know really what they were doing. And so I was going, but I officially left the ICOC when I was 16 years old. I was like, I'm out of here. So that's the whole backstory. I hope that helps.
Because I think that when we started this talk, I mentioned that we'd covered this a number of times before, and I've talked about the Church of Christ with Ashlyn Hilliard and Evie Orman. But now I realize that there is a succinct difference between the Churches of Christ and the International Churches of Christ. I just didn't realize that there was such a severance at a certain point within the COC timeline. And now we get into the ICOC and the ICC, and we're seeing more schisms and more breakdowns and more separations. So you have this umbrella movement, and then within that you have, it's kind of like, I guess you can compare it to the Mormon faith. You have this umbrella, and then it splits and it splits and it splits, as with the Seventh-day Adventist movement as well. Everything goes back to, like, William Branham, and for some reason it's always him somewhere along the line. So
yeah, I was just gonna say too that it is similar to the Latter-day Saints, and then the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. Like I would say the ICOC is like the fundamentalist Latter-day Saint, right? I mean, culturally very different. Like not, I wouldn't say that they are parallels in that way, but as far as the way that the churches interacted with each other. And I think it was around 1990. I'm not sure of the exact year, when Kip McKean declared that they were no longer a part of the Churches of Christ. They were the International Churches of Christ. So that was when they became their own, they declared that they were, a separate organization and a separate church. But yeah, it's and I think all of those churches too, interestingly, I can't remember the name of the period. I think it was the Restoration period, the Restoration movement, Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, Churches of Christ. All of those churches came out of the same period in church history, which is really fascinating. I think it's called like the frontierism or frontier like when people came over from England and like were like trying to like everybody was kind of trying to build their own thing and start their own, like re-understand their religion and their place in it and all that. And so all these sort of groups came up and people were like reinventing church, you know, and like this is kind of the result of that. Like
I guess that's why they have the great awakenings, because you can really identify within each one. Typically, from my knowledge, and I understand that this will be different if you were to look into other major religions, Christian denominations branching off from one another, people reinventing things and interpreting scripture and having visions and prophesizing doomsday and just changing one small thing, which is their caveat. So, you know, Christian Science and Jehovah's Witnesses, some things they'll share, but fundamentally, you know, Christian Science has this idea around faith healing, and Jehovah's Witnesses have this idea around Jehovah and elders and the governing body, more of like people than you know, spiritual guidance, as with Christian Science. So what do you understand of those differences between the COC and the ICOC? Did your parents have to come to understand different tenets and beliefs or practices within the ICOC, or was there really no difference other than who was in charge?
I mean, yes and no. There was definitely differences. Like there was music in our church growing up. I think my dad actually just recently, excuse me, I have something in my eye. He just recently told me of there was some sort of bulletin that Kip McKean came out with where called like wine, women, wine and dance or something. I don't know. I can't even remember. I'm botching it, I'm sure. But basically he came out and said like, it's okay to drink. It's okay to have music. Like music is, okay. And it probably wasn't women. I don't know. But I can't remember. But anyway, there definitely, and I think that was also, I want to say too, like growing up, the church presents, the ICOC in a lot of ways presents itself like a normal, I guess, sort of white evangelical church. I know a lot of white evangelical churches are cults, but it presents itself, it's not like you wouldn't be able to identify us, you know, like you would someone in the Latter-day Saints with the badges, and you wouldn't, or the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints with the long hair and the long, you know, outfits. We I think and I think that was a big part of people's attraction. Again, my mom, I think that was one reason my mom wanted to join, was because, and the other thing too, Kip would say stuff like, oh, the church should look like the city that you're in, right? Like, and the churches of Christ were so white at that point. And so like, again, that's a good and true thing. Like, you know, if you're going to say you're going to serve people in a certain city and you're going to move there and you're bringing a bunch of people there, then you should be having those people in your congregation. They should reflect the community that you're in, right? And so there are these things that like I think people felt really good about, which was, you know, the racial diversity, the being able to, you know, the music, having music. We did do a lot of a cappella still, but we did music too. And there weren't, I guess there weren't as strict restrictions around alcohol, although that still was like a very, I mean, I didn't grow up, my parents didn't drink, you know, I saw wine once and I was like, oh, you know, so I don't know. But yeah, so there were, but it wasn't like a conversation. That was something that my parents were going through, you know, and that I just grew up in as they were sort of, I guess, reevaluating their own values and kind of swept up in this movement. It was a little odd though, because growing up, it was confusing to me. We only ever did stuff within the ICOC. Like we never took family vacations that weren't tied to some sort of conference, within the ICOC. We never went off and did something as a family just to go off and do something as a family, which sounds crazy, but I don't remember going on a vacation that wasn't like visiting relatives, or who all my other relatives were in the Churches of Christ, or doing something that was a part of some sort of event within the International Churches of Christ. And it was confusing to me growing up because, again, my grandfather was a minister, a Church of Christ minister his whole life. And when we would visit family, we would go to church with them. And I remember thinking, like, I guess intuiting as a child, like, oh, this must be the old church, and we give them a break because they're old and their family, you know? And so like, I kind of just resolved that in my head of like, oh, well, it's grandpa, you know? So that's why we go, this is the only other church we would go to. Like, but yeah, we weren't included in, you know, I was too young to be included in sort of all of the, you know, that part of it, as far as like my parents changing their own sort of how they express their faith and all that kind of stuff. But it was, but the other very important, most important point that I want to make is that the worst parts about the Churches of Christ became so much worse in the International Churches of Christ in a very insidious way, as often is the case in coercive groups. So again, like I said, in the mainline Churches of Christ, you know, as my friend would say, like, he grew up thinking, you know, like, well, this is God's true church, you know, and, you know, if you're not going here, you're going to hell. Like, that was heavily exploited by Kip. And just a lot of other things, you know, the rigidity and the fundamentalism in the Churches of Christ was just, and my dad puts it, I think in a funny way. He says, the International Churches of Christ is the Churches of Christ on crack. And I think that that's, you know, a helpful analogy. You take the Churches of Christ, which again is this autonomous group of churches that are very fundamentalist, and you find one leader for them to unify all of that fundamentalism, and unify that rigidity and that legalism, and you get you know, a very it's like the gears come into place, and now it starts, you know, the system is really running really well to keep people in control, and to keep the movement, you know, going. But there was just, and I say it's insidious too, because it's like hard for me to sometimes describe. I know it often is for some people, but because we present it as, you know, like I remember going to a kid's house once as a child. It was only, I think they were probably in the Churches of Christ, which is why my parents were probably friends with them, because we didn't really have any other friends. But one time I went to a friend's house, and she only, I think, how old was I? I don't remember, maybe 10, maybe 8. She only had PG movies. And I knew her family was Christian, but I knew that they weren't in the ICOC. But it was the only like friend that I had ever that was not in the ICOC that was a Christian that I ever went to somebody else's house. I didn't go very often. But I remember thinking, why does she only have PG movies, but my mom and dad let me, you know, watch, you know, PG-13 and all this stuff, right? And that was kind of like, and so again, it's like we weren't like strict, we were strict in these weird ways of like, similar to the Gothards, although I haven't seen the new documentary, the Shiny Happy People, but similar in that we were idolizing the nuclear family, and everything was like, every rule we had and the system that was in place was to like keep families like controlled and together, and just like as this like ideal and idolized like version of healing is like the family unit, you know. And so all the rules of control and the systems of control were around that. So Kip McKean, but practically speaking, Kip McKean wrote this something called the First Principles Studies. So the indoctrination process was around 12 or 13, you were encouraged to study the Bible. And that meant going through a series of studies that he created, that you would go through about once a week, you know, and you always had a discipler above you. So that's the hierarchical structure, I guess, is that, and that's again, that's a part of the shepherding movement and the discipling movement in the United States, which was kind of, again, like overlapping with a lot of Campus Crusade stuff. And I can't remember all the people who were involved there, but you always had somebody over you who was your discipler, and you're the words that they would use are encourage you and give you advice, but it was not that. It was getting permission, right? And it was somebody there to make sure you were in line. But at 12, 13, you were assigned a discipler. You went through these series of studies. And I don't remember if I mentioned this in the ICSA talk, but you know, the indoctrination process is like real. Like if you look at these studies, you realize like what is going on here. They get more and more intense as you read them. You know, they start off sort of, you know, just, oh, we're just educating you and we're making you informed of these things, you know. But then they start to sow the seed of doubt, like, oh, are you really a Christian? How do you know that you're a Christian? Well, people think that they're a Christian and they're actually not really a Christian, and here's why, and here's what it actually means to be a Christian. And then you go through the process of, you know, confessing literally all of your sins. They used to make people write it down, and then they would keep that as a, you know, tool to manipulate people and control people and God, what's the word? Blackmail, you know, essentially people. But yeah, you would go through these series of studies, and you couldn't go to the next study until you got approval from your discipler that you were ready to go to the next study. And then at the end, you had to get approval again to get baptized. And I know some people who went through the studies 2 or 3 times because they didn't cry hard enough at the end. Like they didn't show enough emotion. They weren't satisfied with them saying, well, I haven't really, you know, I don't have any scandalous thing to admit that I've done, right? Like any sins that I've, you know, and so it's really bad, like really bad. And, you know, I'm trying to think of very specific, other specific sort of indoctrinational things, but it's very similar to Jehovah's Witness in that, you know, there's the shunning, you know, of course, it's just, there's so many activities, there's so many picnics and conferences and all sorts of things. You know, you would go to church on Sunday and you would be there for hours, you know, you'd be there for the whole day almost. And you didn't have time to get to know other people. I remember growing up, we only met and got to know other people so that we could invite them to church. Like that was all we did. Was I don't remember actually getting to know other families and making friends and even going to like birthday parties for friends, like school friends. I don't remember doing any of that because, you know, we usually probably had a church thing and so we couldn't go. It wasn't as, you know, and it wasn't as, and I say that to say it wasn't as, again, it's insidious, right? It's implicit. It's not explicit. My parents never said to me, we're not going to go to your friend's birthday party because they don't go to our church. No, they would never say something like that. It just didn't happen because of the system that we were in and the way that the expectations and the pressures that were placed on you to be at everything all the time.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on the International Churches of Christ. For more information, you can visit cultvaultpodcast.com. And to contact me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.